The storm clouds gathered like dark omens over the Montana plains as thunder rolled across the vast expanse of prairie grass. Lightning split the sky in jagged white lines, illuminating the desolate landscape for brief, startling moments before plunging everything back into darkness. The wind howled with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, bending the tall grass in violent waves that crashed against the horizon like an ocean of green. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jacob Matthews pulled his worn hat down lower over his weathered face as he guided his horse through the driving rain. His property stretched for miles in every direction, a testament to years of backbreaking work and sacrifice. The ranch had been in his family for 3 generations, but now it felt more like a prison than a home. Every fence post, every building, every acre of land held memories he'd rather forget. It had been 2 years since the accident. 2 years since his wife Sarah and their unborn child had been taken from him in a senseless tragedy that still haunted his dreams. The drunk driver who ran the red light had walked away without a scratch while Jacob's entire world crumbled in an instant. Since that day, he'd become a man consumed by bitterness, pushing away friends, neighbors, and anyone who tried to reach out with kindness or sympathy. The large wooden gate that marked the entrance to his property came into view through the sheets of rain. Jacob had installed it himself 5 years ago, carving the family name deep into the oak planks with his own hands. Back then, it had been a symbol of pride and accomplishment. Now it felt like a barrier between him and a world that had shown him nothing but cruelty. As he approached the gate, something unusual caught his eye. Through the downpour, he could make out a dark shape crumpled against the wooden posts. At first, he thought it might be debris blown by the storm, perhaps a fallen tree branch or a piece of farm equipment that had broken loose from a neighbor's property. But as he drew closer, his heart began to race with a terrible recognition that it was a person. A woman lay unconscious in the mud, her clothes soaked through and her long brown hair plastered against her pale face. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, and even in the dim light Jacob could see that she was heavily pregnant. Her hands were wrapped protectively around her swollen belly, and her lips had taken on a bluish tinge that spoke of dangerous exposure to the cold. Jacob dismounted quickly, his boots splashing in the muddy puddles as he rushed to her side. Despite his years of self-imposed isolation, his basic human decency kicked in immediately. He knelt beside the woman, pressing his fingers to her neck to check for a pulse. It was there, but weak and irregular. Her skin was ice-cold to the touch, and her breathing was shallow and labored. Ma'am, can you hear me?" he called out, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. There was no response. The woman remained limp and unresponsive, her body shivering involuntarily as the rain continued to pour down on them both. Without hesitation, Jacob scooped the pregnant stranger into his arms. She was lighter than he'd expected, which worried him even more. Pregnant women should be gaining weight, not wasting away. He could feel her ribs through the thin fabric of her dress, suggesting she hadn't been eating properly for some time. Carrying her carefully, Jacob made his way toward the main house. His ranch was substantial, built by his grandfather in the 1920s with thick stone walls and a sturdy roof, designed to withstand the harsh Montana winters. The house had 7 bedrooms, though Jacob only used one now. The others remained exactly as Sarah had left them, shrines to a life that would never be. He kicked open the front door and carried the woman inside, immediately grateful for the warmth that enveloped them. The house was heated by a massive stone fireplace that Jacob kept burning year-round, one of the few comforts he still allowed himself. He laid the unconscious woman on the leather sofa in the living room, quickly grabbing blankets from the hall closet to wrap around her shivering form. As he worked to get her warm and dry, Jacob found himself studying her face more closely. She was beautiful in a delicate, almost fragile way, with high cheekbones and full lips that reminded him painfully of Sarah. But there was something else about her, something that spoke of recent hardship and sorrow. Dark circles ringed her eyes, and her cheeks were hollow with malnutrition. Jacob had seen enough pregnant women in his life to know that this one was in trouble. His own mother had lost 2 babies before he was born, and he remembered the way she'd looked during those difficult pregnancies. This woman had that same desperate, exhausted appearance that spoke of a body pushed beyond its limits. He checked her pulse again, noting that it seemed to be getting stronger now that she was out of the cold. Her breathing was also improving, though she remained unconscious. Jacob knew he should probably call for medical help, but the nearest hospital was 40 miles away, and with the storm raging outside, no ambulance would be able to make it through. The flooded roads. While he waited for her to wake up, Jacob found himself pacing the room like a caged animal. He wasn't used to having people in his house anymore. After Sarah's death, he'd systematically driven away every friend and family member who'd tried to help him through his grief. His sister hadn't spoken to him in over a year, and his few remaining ranch hands knew better than to enter the main house without explicit permission. The woman stirred slightly, letting out a soft moan that made Jacob freeze in his tracks. Her eyelids fluttered, and for a moment it seemed like she might wake up. But then she settled back into unconsciousness, her breathing returning to its shallow, rhythmic pattern. Jacob realized he was going to need supplies if he was going to help this woman properly. He went to the kitchen and began gathering items: clean towels, a first aid kit, bottles of water, and some of the canned soup that made up the bulk of his solitary meals. As he worked, his mind raced with questions about who this woman was and how she'd ended up collapsed at his gate in the middle of a violent storm. There were no other houses for miles in any direction. The nearest neighbor was old Pete Harrison, and his place was a good 10 miles to the east. Beyond that, the small town of Cedar Creek sat another 20 miles down a winding dirt road that became nearly impassable during heavy rains. For someone in her condition to have traveled that far on foot seemed impossible. When Jacob returned to the living room with his supplies, he found the woman's eyes open, staring up at the ceiling with a mixture of confusion and fear. She tried to sit up when she saw him approaching, but her weakened state made the movement difficult. "Easy there," Jacob said, setting down his supplies and raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're safe. You were unconscious outside my gate. I brought you inside to get you warm." The woman's eyes darted around the room, taking in her surroundings with the desperate alertness of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. Her hands moved instinctively to protect her pregnant belly, and Jacob could see the fear written clearly across her delicate features. Where am I?" she asked, her voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. "You're on my ranch about 30 miles outside Cedar Creek," Jacob replied, maintaining his distance to avoid frightening her further. "I'm Jacob Matthews. I found you collapsed at my front gate during the storm." The woman closed her eyes briefly, as if trying to piece together how she'd ended up in this situation. When she opened them again, there were tears glistening on her lashes. I'm Alana Rodriguez," she said finally. "I was walking, trying to find help. The baby. Something's wrong with the baby." Jacob felt his heart clench at her words. The mention of a baby in distress brought back painful memories of Sarah's pregnancy, of all the hopes and dreams they'd had for their unborn child. He pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on the immediate situation. "When's the last time you ate?" he asked, noting again how thin she appeared despite her advanced pregnancy. Elena's eyes dropped to her hands. I don't remember. Maybe yesterday? The day before? I had some crackers I found." The admission hit Jacob like a physical blow. This woman was literally starving, and she was pregnant. Whatever circumstances had led her to his gate, she was clearly in desperate need of help. Despite his years of isolation and bitterness, Jacob found himself unable to turn away from someone in such obvious distress. "I'm going to make you some soup," he said, standing up and heading back toward the kitchen. "And then we need to figure out how to get you to a doctor." "No." Elena's voice carried a panic that stopped Jacob in his tracks. "No doctors, no hospitals. Please, I can single quotes they'll find me." Jacob turned back to study her face, seeing a new layer of fear that had nothing to do with her physical condition. Someone was after this woman, and she was running from more than just poverty and hunger. "Who's looking for you?" he asked gently. Elena's lower lip trembled, and fresh tears began to flow down her cheeks. "My husband, my late husband's family, they think I killed him." The confession hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Jacob had heard enough small-town gossip over the years to know how quickly rumors could spread, and how devastating they could be, especially for someone without resources or connections to fight back. "Did you?" he asked simply. Elena's eyes flashed with a mixture of hurt and anger. "No, never. Thomas died in a car accident 3 months ago. But his family never liked me, said I was just after his money. When the will reading showed, he'd left everything to me and the baby. They started saying I'd planned it all along." Jacob nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. He'd seen similar situations before, where grief and greed combined to create dangerous accusations. In small communities, whispered suspicions could be as damaging as legal charges, especially for someone without the means to defend themselves. "So you ran," he observed. "I had to. They were talking about having me arrested, said they had evidence. I knew they were lying, but I also knew they had enough money and influence to make their lies stick. So I took what little cash I had and started driving. But the car broke down about 5 miles from here, and I've been walking ever since." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elena's story painted a picture of desperation that Jacob recognized all too well. After Sarah's death, he'd felt the same sense of being trapped by circumstances beyond his control, the same feeling that the whole world was conspiring against him. "You said something was wrong with the baby," he reminded her. Elena's hand moved protectively over her swollen belly. "I've been having pains for the last 2 days. Sharp ones that come and go, and there's been some bleeding. I know I need medical care, but I'm afraid if I go to a hospital, they'll contact the authorities back home." Jacob ran a hand through his wet hair, considering the situation. He was no doctor, but he'd assisted with enough animal births on the ranch to recognize the signs of potential complications. Elena needed professional medical attention, but her fear of being discovered created a dangerous dilemma. "The nearest hospital is in Billings," he said finally. "That's about 40 miles from here, and with this storm, the roads are probably flooded anyway. But there's a retired nurse who lives in Cedar Creek, Martha Hayes. She helped deliver half the babies in this county before she retired. Maybe she could take a look at you without involving any official records." Elena's eyes brightened with the first hope Jacob had seen from her. "You would do that? Help me contact her?" Jacob surprised himself by nodding. "Phone lines are probably down from the storm, but I could drive into town tomorrow morning if the roads are passable." "Why?" Elena asked, her voice filled with genuine curiosity. "Why would you help a stranger?" It was a fair question, and one Jacob wasn't entirely sure he could answer. For 2 years he'd actively avoided helping anyone, had built walls around himself specifically to avoid getting involved in other people's problems. But something about Elena's situation, her vulnerability combined with her obvious strength in the face of adversity, had touched something in him that he thought had died with Sarah. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe because I know what it's like to have the whole world turn against you." Elena studied his face for a long moment, seeming to recognize a kindred spirit in his weathered features and tired eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I haven't had anyone be kind to me in so long. I'd almost forgotten what it felt like." Jacob felt an uncomfortable tightness in his chest at her words. When was the last time someone had thanked him for an act of kindness? When was the last time he'd performed one? "Let me get you that soup," he said, turning away before she could see the emotion in his eyes. In the kitchen, Jacob heated a can of chicken noodle soup, one of the few foods he kept stocked for his simple meals. As it warmed on the stove, he found himself thinking about the spare bedrooms upstairs, all of them perfectly preserved but unused. One of them had been intended as a nursery, painted in soft yellow with a crib that Sarah had picked out months before the accident. The thought of Elena sleeping in that room, her pregnant form resting in the bed they'd prepared for their own growing family, was almost too painful to bear. But the other guest rooms were just as loaded with memories of happier times, when the house had been filled with laughter and love instead of silence and regret. Jacob ladled the hot soup into a bowl and carried it back to the living room, along with a glass of milk and some crackers he'd found in the pantry. Elena was sitting up now, looking stronger, but still fragile. "This smells wonderful," she said, accepting the bowl with hands that shook slightly from weakness. As Elena ate, Jacob found himself watching her with a mixture of concern and curiosity. She ate slowly but steadily, as if forcing herself not to devour the food too quickly, despite her obvious hunger. It was the behavior of someone who'd learned to make meals last, who couldn't be sure when the next one might come. "How long have you been on your own?" he asked. Elena paused with the spoon halfway to her mouth. "Since Thomas died. His family made it clear I wasn't welcome at the funeral. Said my presence would be inappropriate given their suspicions. I've been living off our savings, but that ran out pretty quickly once I couldn't work anymore." "What kind of work did you do?" "I was a teacher. Elementary school, 3rd grade. I loved it, but when the rumors started, the school board put me on administrative leave. Said they couldn't have someone under suspicion of murder working with children." Jacob felt anger building in his chest on Elena's behalf. He'd seen how quickly small communities could turn on someone, how gossip and suspicion could destroy a life even without any concrete evidence. "Where was this?" he asked. "Harmony Falls, about 300 miles east of here. It's a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business. Thomas and I moved there when we got married 2 years ago. He was from there. Originally came from one of the founding families. The Rodriguez family has been in Harmony Falls for over a century." "And they really believe you killed him?" Elena set down her spoon, her appetite seemingly diminished by the painful memories. "Thomas's mother, Carmen, never liked me from the day we met. She thought her son should marry someone from their social circle, someone with money and connections. When Thomas chose me instead, she never forgave either of us." Elena's voice grew stronger as she continued, as if telling her story was helping her reclaim some sense of her own truth. "Thomas was a good man, but he was weak when it came to standing up to his family. He'd inherited a successful business from his father, and his mother still had a lot of influence over the company's decisions. She made it clear that our marriage was putting his inheritance at risk." Jacob poured himself a cup of coffee and settled into the chair across from Elena, finding himself genuinely interested in her story. It had been so long since he'd had a real conversation with another person that he'd almost forgotten how it felt to connect with someone else's experiences. "What kind of business?" "Construction. Rodriguez Construction built most of the commercial buildings in Harmony Falls over the past 50 years. It's worth millions, and Carmen wasn't about to let it pass to someone she considered an outsider." "But he left it to you anyway?" Elena nodded, fresh tears beginning to form in her eyes. "He changed his will about a month before the accident. Said he wanted to make sure the baby and I would be taken care of no matter what happened. I had no idea. He'd done it until after the reading. That must have been quite a shock to his family. Carmen went ballistic. Started screaming that I'd manipulated Thomas, that I'd somehow forced him to change the will. She said she'd prove I was a gold digger who'd killed her son for his money. Jacob could imagine the scene, having witnessed similar family dynamics. During his own legal battles after Sarah's death, money had a way of bringing out the worst in people, especially when grief was involved. What evidence did she claim to have? Elena wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, as if protecting herself from the painful memories. She said she had witnesses who'd heard us fighting the night before the accident, so that Thomas had been upset about something, that I'd been pressuring him about money. She also claimed that I'd been researching divorce lawyers, that I was planning to leave him and take half of everything. Were any of those things true? Elena met his eyes directly, her gaze steady and honest. We did have an argument that night, but it wasn't about money. Thomas had been drinking more lately, and I was worried about him. He'd been under a lot of pressure from his mother to divorce me, and it was eating him alive. I was trying to get him to talk to someone, maybe a counselor. And the divorce lawyer research? Complete fabrication. I loved Thomas despite his flaws. I was planning our future together, not looking for a way out. Jacob found himself believing her. There was something in Elena's manner, a straightforward honesty combined with genuine grief, that rang true. He'd learned to read people pretty well over the years, and his instincts told him this woman was telling the truth. So what happened the night of the accident? Elena's voice grew quiet, and Jacob could see the pain etched in every line of her face. Thomas left the house around 10 o'clock. Said he needed to drive around and think. He'd been drinking, but not heavily. I begged him not to go, told him we could talk it through, but he was determined. Said he needed space to figure things out. She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. He never came home. The police found his car wrapped around a tree about 5 miles outside town. They said he must have fallen asleep at the wheel. Or maybe hit some ice. It was February, and the roads were slick. "I'm sorry," Jacob said simply, recognizing the inadequacy of the words, but meaning them nonetheless. Elena wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "The worst part is that Carmen has convinced half the town that I somehow caused the accident. She says I drove him to drink, that I was emotionally abusing him. Some people even think I sabotaged his car somehow." That's a serious accusation. Did the police investigate? They did an initial investigation and ruled it an accident. But Carmen hired a private investigator, and she's been putting pressure on the sheriff to reopen the case. She has a lot of influence in town, and people are starting to listen to her. Jacob shook his head in disgust. He'd seen similar situations where money and social standing could override facts and evidence. It was one of the many reasons he'd grown cynical about human nature over the past few years. "So you decided to run rather than fight. What choice did I have? I'm pregnant, unemployed, and facing accusations of murder from one of the most powerful families in town. Even if I could prove my innocence, the legal battle would cost more money than I have. And in the meantime, I'd be living under a cloud of suspicion." Elena's practical assessment of her situation showed an intelligence and realism that Jacob respected. She wasn't running from responsibility or avoiding consequences. She was making the calculated decision based on the realities of her circumstances. "Where were you planning to go?" "I have a sister in Oregon. We haven't spoken in years, but I was hoping she might let me stay with her until the baby is born." After that ... double quotes Elena shrugged helplessly. "I don't know. Start over somewhere new, I guess." Jacob looked out the window where the storm was still raging with undiminished fury. The rain was coming down in torrents, and the wind was strong enough to bend the large oak trees that surrounded the house. Even if Elena wanted to continue her journey, it would be impossible in these conditions. "Well, you're not going anywhere tonight," he said. "This storm looks like it's going to last until..." Morning at least. Elena's eyes filled with gratitude and relief. Thank you. I know this is an imposition, having a stranger show up at your door like this. It's fine, Jacob replied, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. Having another person in the house, especially a pregnant woman, was stirring up emotions and memories he'd spent 2 years trying to suppress. As if sensing his discomfort, Elena attempted to reassure him. I'll leave as soon as the weather clears. I don't want to be a burden. You're not a burden, Jacob said, surprising himself with the firmness of his response. And rushing off in your condition wouldn't be smart anyway. Like I said, we should get Martha Hayes to take a look at you first. Elena nodded gratefully, then winced suddenly, her hand flying to her belly. Another pain? Jacob asked, immediately alert. Yes, they're getting stronger, and more frequent. Elena's face had gone pale, and Jacob could see sweat beading on her forehead. Despite the warmth of the room, Jacob's mind raced through his limited knowledge of pregnancy complications. He'd never dealt with human births, but he'd assisted with enough difficult animal deliveries to recognize the signs of potential trouble. How far along are you? About 36 weeks, I think. The baby isn't due for another month. Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. If Elena was going into premature labor, she needed medical attention immediately. But with the roads flooded and the phones likely down, getting help would be nearly impossible. I think we need to prepare for the possibility that you might be going into labor, he said carefully. Elena's eyes widened with fear. But it's too early. The baby isn't ready. Babies born at 36 weeks can be fine, Jacob said, though he wasn't entirely sure if that was true. But we need to be prepared just in case. As if to underscore his point, another contraction hit Elena, stronger than the previous ones. She doubled over, gripping the arm of the sofa as she breathed through the pain. Jacob knelt beside her, feeling helpless and out of his depth. What can I do? I don't know, Elena gasped. I've never done this before. Neither had Jacob, at least not with a human birth. But watching Elena struggle through the contraction, seeing the fear and pain in her eyes, he made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. We're going to get through this together, he said, taking her hand in his. Whatever happens, you're not alone. Elena squeezed his hand gratefully, and for the first time in 2 years, Jacob felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with his own pain and everything to do with helping someone else survive theirs. The contractions continued throughout the night, each one seeming to grip Elena with increasing intensity. Jacob had moved her to the master bedroom on the ground floor, reasoning that it would be easier to get help if needed without having to navigate stairs. The room felt strange with another person in it. He hadn't shared the space since Sarah's death, and the familiar surroundings took on an almost surreal quality in the lamplight. Jacob had gathered every clean towel and sheet he could find, along with his basic first aid supplies. His veterinary knowledge was limited, but he knew the basics of sterilization and emergency care. What worried him most was his complete lack of experience with human childbirth complications. Tell me about the pains, he said, settling into a chair beside the bed as Elena worked through another contraction. Are they getting closer together? Elena nodded, her face flushed and damp with perspiration. They started about 20 minutes apart, but now they're coming every 10 minutes or so. And they're lasting longer each time. Jacob had been keeping track of an old pocket watch, confirming Elena's assessment. By his calculations, labor was progressing faster than might be expected. For a first-time mother, the thought both relieved and terrified him. If the baby was coming quickly, Elena wouldn't have to suffer for days, but it also meant they had less time to get professional help. Have you felt the baby moving recently? He asked, remembering something he'd heard about monitoring fetal activity during labor. Elena placed both hands on her belly, concentrating for a moment. Yes, but not as much as usual. Maybe the baby is getting ready to be born. Jacob hoped that was all it was, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Elena's color wasn't good, and she seemed to be getting weaker with each contraction rather than stronger. "I'm going to try calling Martha Hayes again," he said, standing up and heading for the kitchen phone. He'd been attempting to reach the retired nurse every hour since the storm began, but the lines remained down. The phone was still dead. Jacob stood in the kitchen, staring out at the raging storm and feeling more helpless than he had since the night Sarah died. At least then, the accident had been over in an instant. There had been nothing he could have done to change the outcome. This situation was different. Elena needed help, and he was the only person available to provide it. When he returned to the bedroom, he found Elena sitting on the edge of the bed, doubled over with another contraction. This one seemed more intense than the previous ones, lasting nearly a full minute before it began to subside. "Jacob," she gasped, reaching out for his hand. "Something's happening. I think my water just broke." Jacob looked down and saw that the sheets beneath Elena were indeed soaked with clear fluid. His heart began to race as he realized that active labor had officially begun. There would be no turning back now, no time to wait for professional help. "Okay," he said, forcing his voice to remain calm despite the panic rising in his chest. "We can handle this. Women have been having babies for thousands of years without hospitals." Elena managed a weak smile. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one having the baby." Despite the gravity of the situation, Jacob found himself almost smiling at her attempt at humor, even in the midst of what was clearly a frightening experience. Elena was trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. "What can I do to help?" he asked. "I don't know," Elena admitted. "I read some books about childbirth, but it all seems different when it's actually happening to you." Jacob thought back to the animal births he'd assisted with over the years. While human childbirth was obviously different, some of the basic principles had to be the same. The key was to stay calm, keep everything as clean as possible, and let nature take its course unless there were obvious complications. "Let's get you into something more comfortable," he suggested. "And we should change these sheets." Jacob helped Elena into one of Sarah's old nightgowns, trying not to think about the painful irony of the situation. The gown had been intended for Sarah's own pregnancy, purchased in anticipation of late-night feedings and comfortable recovery. Now it was serving a stranger who'd stumbled into his life during the worst storm he'd seen in years. As they worked together to make Elena more comfortable, Jacob found himself talking to fill the silence between contractions. "This room used to belong to my parents," he said, smoothing fresh sheets over the mattress. "I was born right here in this house, actually. Back then, most babies in rural areas were delivered at home." "That's comforting to know," Elena said, settling back against the pillows. "At least this room has experience with births." Another contraction hit before Jacob could respond, and this time Elena's reaction was more intense. She gripped the bed sheets with white knuckles, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "Breathe through it," Jacob encouraged, remembering something he'd heard about labor breathing techniques. Long, slow breaths. Elena tried to follow his advice, but the pain was clearly overwhelming. When the contraction finally passed, she looked up at Jacob with tears in her eyes. "I'm scared," she whispered. "What if something goes wrong? What if the baby gets hurt because I couldn't get to a hospital?" Jacob sat down on the edge of the bed, taking Elena's hand in his. Her fingers were cold and trembling, and he could feel the rapid pulse at her wrist. "Nothing's going to go wrong," he said firmly. "You're strong, and your body knows what to do. I'll be right here with you the entire time." "But you don't know anything about delivering babies," Elena protested. "I know more than you might think," Jacob replied. "I've been helping animals give birth for 20 years. The basic process is the same. Elena looked at him with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Animals are different from people. In some ways, yes. But birth is one of the most natural processes in the world. Your body has been preparing for this for months. We just need to trust the process and be ready to help when the time comes. As if summoned by their conversation, another contraction began building. This one was noticeably stronger than the previous ones, causing Elena to cry out, in pain for the first time. How long do these usually last? Jacob asked when the contraction subsided. The book said first babies usually take 12 to 20 hours from start to finish, Elena panted. But I've been having pains for days, so maybe it won't take as long. Jacob nodded, though privately he was concerned about Elena's energy levels. She'd been malnourished and exhausted even before labor began, and the physical demands of childbirth were significant even for healthy women. When did you last sleep? He asked. Really sleep? I don't remember. Maybe 3 days ago? I've been too scared to sleep deeply since I started running. The admission worried Jacob even more. Elena needed strength for what lay ahead, but she was already running on empty. He made a mental note to encourage her to rest between contractions. If possible, over the next few hours, Jacob settled into a routine of monitoring Elena's progress and trying to make her as comfortable as possible. He brought her ice chips to suck on, knowing that staying hydrated would be important. He also prepared warm washcloths to place on her forehead during contractions, and he kept track of the timing and intensity of each labor-pain dot as dawn began to break outside. The storm finally started to weaken. The thunder became more distant, and the driving rain settled into a steady downpour, rather than the violent sheets of water that had been battering the house all night. Maybe I can get into town now, Jacob suggested during a brief lull between contractions. The roads might be passable. Elena grabbed his arm with surprising strength. Don't leave me, please. I can't do this alone. Jacob looked into her frightened eyes and realized she was right. Even if he could make it to town, the round trip would take at least 2 hours, and there was no guarantee he'd be able to bring help back before the baby arrived. I'm not going anywhere, he assured her. We're going to see this through together. As the morning progressed, Elena's contractions became more frequent and intense. Jacob could see that she was entering what he believed was the active phase of labor, though he wasn't entirely sure what that meant in practical terms. I need to push, Elena announced suddenly, her voice filled with urgency. Jacob felt his heart skip a beat. He'd been hoping they'd have more time, that somehow help would arrive before they reached this crucial moment. But Elena's body was making the decision for them. Are you sure? He asked. Yes, I can feel the baby moving down. It's time. Jacob took a deep breath, pushing aside his fears and uncertainties. Elena needed him to be strong and confident, even if he didn't feel either of those things. Okay, he said, moving to the foot of the bed. Tell me what you're feeling, and we'll work through this together. What followed was the most intense and frightening hour of Jacob's life. Elena's body took over with an ancient rhythm that seemed to bypass her conscious mind, and Jacob found himself serving as both coach and medical assistant in a drama that was simultaneously terrifying and miraculous. I can see the baby's head, he announced with wonder and relief when Elena's pushing finally began to show results. Is everything okay? Elena gasped between pushes. Is the baby all right? Jacob examined what he could see of the emerging infant, looking for any obvious signs of distress. The baby's face was red and scrunched, but that seemed normal for a newborn. More importantly, he could see no signs of the cord wrapped around the neck, which had been one of his biggest fears. Everything looks good, he reported. Just keep doing what you're doing. 3 more pushes, and suddenly the baby slipped free into Jacob's waiting hands. For a moment, he simply stared in amazement at the tiny, perfect human being he was holding. The baby was smaller than he'd expected, but appeared to be fully formed and healthy. Is it okay? Is the baby breathing? Elena asked frantically. Jacob looked more closely and realized the baby wasn't crying or moving. His heart stopped for a moment before his instincts kicked in. He'd dealt with this situation before with newborn animals. Sometimes babies needed a little encouragement to take their first breath. Gently but firmly, Jacob cleared the baby's mouth and nose with his finger, then gave the tiny chest a few light taps. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, the baby suddenly drew in a gasping breath and let out a strong, healthy cry. "It's a girl," Jacob announced, his voice thick with emotion as he carefully wrapped the baby in a clean towel. "And she's beautiful." Elena broke into tears of relief and joy as Jacob placed the tiny infant in her arms. "She's so small," Elena whispered, staring in wonder at her daughter's face. "Small but perfect," Jacob agreed, settling into the chair beside the bed to watch the new mother and baby bond. The sight of Elena cradling her newborn daughter stirred emotions in Jacob that he'd thought were buried forever. He remembered the excitement he and Sarah had felt when they'd learned they were expecting, the plans they'd made, the nursery they'd prepared. Watching Elena experience those first moments of motherhood was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "What will you name her?" he asked quietly. Elena studied the baby's face for a long moment before answering. "Hope. Her name is Hope." Jacob felt tears prick his eyes at the simple but profound choice. After everything Elena had been through, the loss of her husband, the accusations, the flight from home, the dangerous childbirth, she was still able to look at her daughter and see hope for the future. "That's a perfect name," he said softly. As Elena nursed Hope for the first time, Jacob busied himself with the practical aftermath of childbirth. He'd read enough to know that the placenta still needed to be delivered, and he wanted to make sure Elena didn't develop any complications. "How are you feeling?" he asked as he changed the bloodied sheets. "Exhausted," Elena admitted, "but also relieved, and I'm grateful. I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done." Jacob paused in his work, looking at the woman who'd stumbled into his life less than 24 hours ago. In that short time, she'd managed to crack open the walls he'd built around his heart, forcing him to care about someone other than himself for the first time in 2 years. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I should be thanking you." Elena looked puzzled. "For what?" "For reminding me what it feels like to help someone. For giving me a reason to care about something besides my own pain." Before Elena could respond, they heard the sound of a car engine outside. Jacob moved to the window and saw a pickup truck pulling into his driveway, apparently having made it through the flooded roads. "Looks like help has finally arrived," he said, recognizing Martha Hayes' old Ford. The retired nurse knocked on the front door moments later, and Jacob hurried to let her in. Martha was a woman in her 70s with silver hair and the competent manner of someone who delivered hundreds of babies over her long career. "Jacob Matthews, I've been trying to get out here since yesterday," she said, shaking the rain from her coat. "Heard on the scanner that someone might need medical attention." "In here," Jacob said, leading her to the bedroom where Elena was resting with baby Hope. Martha took one look at the scene and immediately shifted into professional mode. She examined both mother and baby with gentle efficiency, checking vital signs and looking for any signs of complications. "You did good work," she told Jacob after completing her examination. "Both mother and baby are healthy, though the little one could use a few more pounds." "She was born early," Elena explained. "About 4 weeks, I think." Martha nodded. "She's a good size for 36 weeks. Probably around 5 pounds, I'd guess. Small but strong." As Martha continued her examination, Jacob found himself stepping back and really looking at the scene before him. Elena, exhausted but radiant with new motherhood. Baby Hope, sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. Martha, bustling around with the confident movements of someone in her element. For the first time since Sarah's death, his house felt alive again. The master bedroom, which had been a shrine to his grief, was now the site of new life and new beginnings. The irony wasn't lost on him that Elena's crisis had forced him to confront his own isolation and begin the process of healing. "Where will you go now?" Martha asked Elena as she packed up her supplies. Elena's face clouded with uncertainty. "I don't know. I was trying to get to my sister in Oregon, but nothing," Jacob interrupted, surprising everyone including himself. "You're not going anywhere, not yet." Elena stared at him in amazement. "Jacob, I can't impose on you any longer. You've already done so much. It's not an imposition," Jacob said firmly. "You just had a baby. You need time to recover, and Hope needs a safe, stable environment for her first few weeks. This house has plenty of room." Martha looked between Jacob and Elena with the knowing eyes of someone who'd seen human nature in all its forms. "The man's right," she said to Elena. "You shouldn't be traveling with a newborn, especially given your circumstances. And you," she turned to Jacob, "you could use the company. This house has been too quiet for too long." Elena's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "Are you sure? I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden," Jacob repeated. You're family now. You and Hope both." The words surprised Jacob as much as they did Elena, but he realized they were true. In the space of one dramatic night, this stranger and her baby had become important to him in a way he hadn't thought possible. "There's something else," Martha said, her expression growing serious. "I heard some talk in town yesterday. Strangers asking questions about a pregnant woman who might be passing through. Might be nothing, but you should be careful." Elena's face went pale. "They found me. Carmen Rodriguez has people looking for me." Jacob felt a surge of protective anger. "They won't find you here. And even if they do, they'll have to go through me to get to you." Elena looked at Jacob with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "You don't understand what you're getting into. Carmen Rodriguez has money and connections. She can make life very difficult for people who cross her." "Let her try," Jacob said grimly. "I've dealt with bullies before." Martha gathered her things and prepared to leave, but not before giving both Jacob and Elena some final advice. "Take care of each other," she said simply. "And don't let anyone tell you that helping someone in need is wrong. Sometimes that's the only thing that keeps us human." After Martha left, Jacob and Elena sat in comfortable silence, watching baby Hope sleep. The storm had finally passed completely, leaving behind clear skies and the fresh smell of rain-washed earth. "What happens now?" Elena asked quietly. Jacob considered the question carefully. 24 hours ago, his biggest concern had been avoiding human contact and nursing his own wounds. Now he was responsible for the safety and well-being of a woman and child who were depending on him for protection. "Now we figure out how to keep you safe," he said. "And we give Hope the best start in life we can." Elena smiled through her tears. "I still can't believe you're willing to do this for strangers." "You're not strangers anymore," Jacob replied, reaching out to gently touch Hope's tiny hand. "You're family. And family protects family." As the sun set on their second day together, Jacob realized that Elena and Hope had given him something he'd thought he'd lost forever, a reason to hope for the future. The bitter, isolated man who'd found Elena collapsed at his gate was gone, replaced by someone who was ready to fight for the people he cared about. The real test, however, was yet to come. Somewhere out there, powerful people were looking for Elena and her baby, and Jacob knew that the peaceful interlude they'd shared was likely to be short-lived. But for now, in the quiet sanctity of his home, 3 people who'd been broken by life were beginning the process of healing together. And for Jacob Matthews, that was enough to start with. 3 weeks had passed since Hope's dramatic entrance into the world, and the old ranch house had undergone a transformation that went far beyond the physical presence of a woman and baby. Jacob found himself waking each morning to sounds he'd forgotten existed, the soft murmur of Elena singing lullabies, the gentle cooing of an infant discovering her voice, the rustle of daily life happening in rooms that had stood silent for too long. The nursery that Sarah had prepared with such care was finally being used, though Jacob had needed several days to work up the courage to suggest it. Elena had been hesitant at first, understanding the emotional weight of the gesture. But Hope's needs had eventually overcome both their reservations. Seeing the yellow walls and carefully chosen furniture serve their intended purpose brought Jacob a bittersweet sense of closure he hadn't expected. Elena proved to be a natural mother, despite her fears about inexperience. She moved through the daily routines of caring for Hope with an intuitive grace that reminded Jacob of his own mother's stories about the early days of his childhood. But beneath her maternal confidence, Jacob could sense a constant undercurrent of anxiety. Elena jumped at unexpected sounds, kept the curtains drawn during daylight hours, and never ventured outside without first scanning the horizon for unfamiliar vehicles. Her paranoia wasn't unfounded. Twice in the past week, strangers had stopped at neighboring ranches asking questions about a pregnant woman traveling alone. Joe Harrison had driven over to warn them after turning away a well-dressed man who claimed to be a private investigator, hired by concerned family members. Description matched Elena perfectly, Joe had reported grimly. Said they were worried about her mental state, that she might be dangerous to herself and the baby. Real convincing story, but something about the man didn't sit right with me. Jacob had thanked Joe for the warning and increased his vigilance around the property. He'd taken to carrying his rifle when doing chores, and he'd installed motion sensors on the main access road, precautions that would have seemed paranoid a month ago but now felt entirely reasonable. The isolation that had once been Jacob's preference was now a strategic advantage. His ranch sat at the end of a 5-mile dirt road with only one way in or out. Anyone approaching would be visible long before they reached the house, giving Jacob and Elena time to prepare for unwanted visitors. But the constant threat of discovery was taking its toll on Elena's recovery. She'd lost weight since Hope's birth, despite Jacob's efforts to ensure she ate regularly. Dark circles had returned under her eyes, and she often stared out the windows with the hunted expression of someone expecting the worst. "You can't keep living like this," Jacob told her one morning as they shared coffee on the front porch. Hope was sleeping peacefully in a basket beside Elena's chair, her tiny face serene in the morning sunlight. Like what? Elena asked, though. They both knew what he meant. Like a prisoner. Like someone waiting for the executioner to arrive. "This is supposed to be a time of joy for you, celebrating Hope's arrival. Instead, you're consumed with fear." Elena sipped her coffee slowly, considering his words. "Easy to say when you're not the one being hunted. Every day I stay here, I'm putting you and Hope at greater risk. Maybe I should just turn myself in, face whatever Carmen has planned." "Absolutely not," Jacob said firmly. "Running back to face false accusations isn't bravery, it's surrender. We need a better plan." "We?" Elena looked at him with raised eyebrows. "Jacob, this isn't your fight. You've already done more than anyone could expect." Jacob set down his coffee cup and turned to face her directly. "It became my fight the moment I decided to help you. I'm not backing down now." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of an approaching vehicle. Both Jacob and Elena tensed, but relaxed when they recognized Martha Hayes' pickup truck winding up the access road. Martha had become a regular visitor over the past 3 weeks, officially to monitor Hope's development, but unofficially to provide companionship and support to Elena during her recovery. The older woman had taken a motherly interest in both Elena and the baby, often arriving with homemade meals and practical advice about infant care. "Morning, folks," Martha called out as she climbed the porch steps. "How's our little angel today?" "Growing. Stronger every day," Elena replied. lifting Hope from her basket to show Martha how alert and responsive the baby had become. Martha examined Hope with the practiced eye of someone who'd monitored hundreds of newborns over her career. "She's thriving," she announced with satisfaction. "Good color, good muscle tone, excellent appetite. You're doing everything right, Elena." The praise brought the first genuine smile Jacob had seen on Elena's face in days. Despite her fears about the outside world, she was clearly flourishing in her role as Hope's mother. "I brought some things from town," Martha continued, producing a bag of supplies from her truck. "Baby clothes, formula in case you need it, and some interesting news." Jacob and Elena exchanged glances at Martha's tone. The older woman's expression had grown serious, suggesting that her news wasn't entirely positive. "What kind of news?" Jacob asked. "The kind that confirms your suspicions about those people looking for Elena," Martha replied. "I did some checking with friends who still have connections in law enforcement. Carmen Rodriguez has indeed hired a private investigation firm, but not just to find Elena." Elena felt her heart sink. What else? "She's building a case for kidnapping. Charges. Claims Elena took the baby and fled to avoid prosecution for Thomas's murder. She's got the local sheriff convinced that Elena is mentally unstable and potentially dangerous." The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd known. Carmen was vindictive, but she hadn't imagined the woman would go so far as to manufacture criminal charges. "But that's completely false," Elena protested. "Hope is my daughter. You can't kidnap your own child." "Legally, you're right," Martha agreed. "But Carmen's story is that you fled to avoid murder charges, taking an unborn child into a dangerous situation. She's claiming that your actions put the baby at risk, which could be construed as child endangerment." Jacob felt anger building in his chest. This is all fabricated nonsense. Carmen Rodriguez is using the legal system to persecute an innocent woman. "Of course it is," Martha said. "But that doesn't mean it isn't effective. Carmen has money, influence, and connections. She can make her version of events seem plausible to people who don't know the truth." Elena buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was facing. "So even if I prove I didn't kill Thomas, I could still lose Hope. Carmen could convince a court that I'm an unfit mother." The thought of losing her daughter was more terrifying than any threat to her own freedom. Hope represented everything. Good that had come from her marriage to Thomas, the one pure joy that had emerged from months of grief and persecution. "There's more," Martha continued reluctantly. "Carmen has filed a motion for emergency custody, claiming the baby is in immediate danger. If a judge grants it, law enforcement will be authorized to take Hope into protective custody the moment they find you." Jacob stood up abruptly, pacing to the edge of the porch as he processed this new threat. The situation was escalating beyond simple accusations into active legal warfare, with Hope as the ultimate prize. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Hard to say. The legal system moves slowly, but emergency custody motions get priority. Could be days, could be weeks." Elena looked up from Hope's peaceful face, her expression hardening with a determination Jacob hadn't seen before. "I won't let her take my daughter," she said quietly. "Whatever I have to do, wherever I have to go, Carmen Rodriguez will not get." Her hands on Hope. "You don't have to run again," Jacob said, returning to sit beside her. "There has to be another way to fight this." Martha cleared her throat delicately. "Actually, there might be, but it would require taking some risks." "Both." Jacob and Elena turned to her expectantly. "I've been thinking about this situation for weeks," Martha continued. "Carmen's entire case is built on the assumption that Elena is isolated and vulnerable, that she has no support system or credible witnesses to contradict the accusations." "That's essentially true," Elena pointed out. "Not anymore," Martha replied, with a slight smile. "You have Jacob, you have me, and you have a growing network of people in this community who've gotten to know you over the past few weeks. What if instead of hiding, we went on the offensive? Jacob leaned forward, intrigued by the suggestion. What do you mean? I mean, we build our own case. We document Elena's character, her fitness as a mother, her circumstances when she arrived here. We gather evidence that contradicts Carmen's narrative. Elena shook her head skeptically. What? Evidence? It's my word against Carmen's, and she has all the advantages. Not necessarily, Martha said. I've delivered a lot of babies over the years, and I've learned to read situations pretty well. Your behavior, your maternal instincts, your obvious love for hope, none of that supports the picture Carmen is trying to paint. Jacob began to see where Martha was heading. You're talking about character witnesses, people who can testify to Elena's true nature. Exactly. And more than that, we need to investigate Thomas's death ourselves. If Carmen is lying about Elena's involvement, there might be evidence that proves it. Elena looked between Jacob and Martha with a mixture of hope and terror. You're talking about going back, confronting Carmen directly. Not directly, Martha clarified. But we need to stop playing defense and start playing offense. Hiding only works for so long. Jacob stood up again, his mind racing through the possibilities and risks of Martha's suggestion. The idea of actively investigating Thomas's death appealed to his sense of justice, but it would also expose Elena to greater danger. What would that look like practically? He asked. Martha pulled a notebook from her bag, revealing that she'd been thinking about this plan for some time. First, we document everything about Elena's condition when she arrived here. The malnutrition, the exhaustion, the signs of stress and fear. We create a medical record that shows she was fleeing abuse. Not prosecution. Would that hold up in court? Elena asked. It would support your version of events, Martha replied. Second, we investigate Thomas's death more thoroughly. If he really died in an accident, there should be evidence that contradicts any murder theory. Jacob was warming to the idea despite his concerns. What about the inheritance issue? That seems to be at the heart of Carmen's accusations. That's where things get interesting, Martha said with a knowing look. I did some checking into the Rodriguez family finances. Thomas's construction company has been struggling for the past 2 years. There are rumors about bad investments and cash flow problems. Elena looked surprised. Thomas never mentioned any business troubles to me. He might not have known the full extent of it, Martha suggested. But if the company is in worse shape than Carmen let on, that inheritance might not be worth as much as she's fighting for. Jacob saw the implications immediately. So Carmen might be fighting for control of a failing business, not a valuable inheritance. That would give her motive to eliminate Elena from the picture. Exactly. And if we can prove that Carmen knew about the financial problems, while Thomas didn't, it might suggest she had reasons to want Elena discredited or eliminated. Elena was beginning to look hopeful for the first time in weeks. You really think we could prove my innocence? I think we can create enough reasonable doubt to protect you and hope, Martha replied. But it won't be easy, and it won't be safe. Carmen won't sit still while we investigate her. Jacob had heard enough. What do you need from me? Martha smiled at his immediate commitment. Your ranch is a base of operations, your protection for Elena and Hope, and your help with the investigation. I have contacts in Harmony Falls who might be willing to help, but I'll need backup. You'll have it, Jacob said without hesitation. Elena looked at both of them with tears in her eyes. I can't ask you to risk yourselves for me. If Carmen finds out what you're doing, she could destroy your lives too. She can try, Jacob replied grimly. But I've been destroyed before, and I survived it. Besides, this isn't just about you anymore. It's about justice, and it's about protecting Hope. Martha nodded in agreement. And it's about standing up to bullies who think money and influence put them above the law. I've seen too many good people suffer because they couldn't fight back against powerful enemies. Over the next several hours, the three of them worked out the details of their plan. Martha would return to Cedar Creek and begin reaching out to her contacts in Harmony Falls, looking for people who might have information about Thomas's death or the Rodriguez family's financial situation. Jacob would research Carmen Rodriguez and her business connections, looking for any vulnerabilities or inconsistencies in her story. Elena would focus on documenting her own experiences with Thomas and his family, creating a detailed timeline of events that could be used to contradict Carmen's accusations. It was difficult work, forcing her to relive painful memories, but she approached it with new determination. "There's one more thing," Martha said as she prepared to leave. "We need to consider the possibility that this investigation might attract more attention to your location. If Carmen's people are already looking for you, they might intensify their search once they realize you're fighting back." Jacob had been thinking about the same issue. "I can handle increased security, but Elena and Hope can't stay locked in the house indefinitely. What are you suggesting?" Elena asked. "That we give you a new identity, at least temporarily. If investigators come around asking about Elena Rodriguez, they won't find her." Elena looked confused. "How is that possible?" Martha smiled mysteriously. "Small communities are good at protecting their own when they want to. As far as anyone in Cedar Creek knows, you're my niece visiting from the back east, helping me with some medical work while you recover from a difficult pregnancy. Would people really go along with that?" Elena asked skeptically. "They would if I asked them to," Martha replied confidently. "I've delivered half the babies in this county and treated the other half when they were sick. People trust me, and they'll trust my judgment about you." Jacob felt a surge of gratitude toward the older woman. Martha was risking her own reputation and relationships to help Elena, demonstrating the kind of community loyalty he'd almost forgotten existed. "What about official records?" he asked practically. "We'll worry about that if it becomes necessary," Martha said. "For now, we just need to buy time to conduct our investigation." As Martha drove away, Jacob and Elena stood on the porch watching the dust settle behind her truck. Hope had woken up and was making the soft sounds that indicated she would soon be hungry. "Do you really think this could work?" Elena asked as she prepared to feed her daughter. Jacob considered the question carefully. 3 weeks ago, he would have said no, that fighting powerful enemies was a fool's errand that would only make things worse. But 3 weeks ago, he'd been a different man, one consumed by his own grief and convinced that the world was fundamentally unfair. "I think it's our best chance," he said finally. "And I think we have something Carmen doesn't expect." "What's that?" Jacob looked out at his ranch, at the land his family had worked for generations, at the community that was rallying to help a stranger in need. "We have people who care about doing the right thing, not just winning. That's more powerful than money when it really matters." Elena smiled, the first genuinely peaceful expression Jacob had seen on her face since she'd arrived. "Hope is lucky to have you in her life," she said softly. Jacob felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I'm the lucky one. You both gave me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "A reason to fight for something besides my own pain." As the sun set over the Montana plains, Jacob Matthews realized that his transformation was complete. The bitter, isolated man who'd found Elena collapsed at his gate was gone, replaced by someone ready to stand up for justice and family. The real battle was just beginning, but for the first time in years, Jacob felt like he was on the right side of a fight worth winning. That night, as Elena settled Hope for sleep in the nursery Sarah had prepared, Jacob sat in his study planning their next moves. Carmen Rodriguez had money and influence, but she was about to discover that she'd picked the wrong family to destroy. The pregnant widow who'd collapsed at his gate had become the catalyst for his own resurrection, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that away from any of them, The investigation would be dangerous, the outcome uncertain. But Jacob had learned something important over the past 3 weeks. Sometimes the most important battles aren't the ones you choose, but the ones that choose you. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, fighting for someone else's justice helps. You find your own redemption in the process. The investigation began in earnest 2 days later when Martha returned with information that would change everything they thought they knew about Thomas Rodriguez's death. She arrived at the ranch carrying a manila folder thick with documents and wearing the grim expression of someone who discovered uncomfortable truths. "We need to talk," she announced without preamble as Jacob and Elena gathered in the living room. Hope was napping in her carrier, oblivious to the adult conversations that would determine her future. Martha spread the contents of her folder across the coffee table: newspaper clippings, police reports, financial documents, and photographs that Elena had never seen before. The scope of her research was impressive and slightly intimidating. "I spent yesterday in Harmony Falls," Martha began. "Officially, I was visiting my cousin who works at the county courthouse. Unofficially, I was investigating everything I could find about your husband's death and the Rodriguez family business." Elena leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What did you find?" "Thomas's accident wasn't the first suspicious incident involving Rodriguez Construction," Martha replied, pulling out a newspaper clipping from 18 months earlier. "Look at this." The headline read, "Construction Foreman Dies in Equipment Accident." Elena scanned the article with growing alarm as she recognized the name, Miguel Santos, a man who'd worked for Thomas's company for over 15 years. "I remember." "Miguel," Elena said slowly. "Thomas was devastated when he died. Said Miguel was like a second father to him." "According to this report, Miguel died when a crane malfunctioned at a job site," Martha continued. "But I spoke to several of his former co-workers, and they told a different story." Jacob studied the newspaper photo of the accident scene. "What kind of different story?" Miguel had been asking questions about missing materials and inflated invoices. He'd noticed that expensive equipment was being billed to jobs but never actually delivered to the work sites. When he brought these concerns to management, he was told to mind his own business. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. "You think Miguel was killed because he discovered financial irregularities?" "I think Miguel discovered that someone was embezzling from Rodriguez Construction, and that discovery made him a liability," Martha replied. "The timing of his accident was awfully convenient." Jacob was beginning to see a pattern. And then Thomas started asking similar questions. Exactly. According to several sources, Thomas had become increasingly concerned about the company's finances in the months before his death. He'd been conducting his own investigation into the missing materials and questionable contracts. Elena remembered Thomas's growing anxiety during their final weeks together, his late nights poring over company books, his increasing tension with his mother about business decisions. At the time, she'd attributed his stress to the pregnancy and his struggles with family expectations. Did Thomas find evidence of embezzlement? She asked. Martha pulled out a photocopy of bank records that she'd obtained through contacts Elena didn't want to know about. He found more than that. He discovered that someone had been systematically draining the company's accounts for over 2 years. The financial documents painted a picture of deliberate theft on a massive scale. Construction materials that were purchased but never delivered, subcontractor payments that went to non-existent companies, equipment rentals that appeared on invoices but never on job sites. "How much money are we talking about?" Jacob asked. "Close to $2 million, Martha replied grimly. "And that's just what I could track down with limited access to records." Elena stared at the documents in shock. She'd known Rodriguez Construction was successful, but she'd had no idea about the company's true financial situation or the extent of the theft that was destroying it from within. "Who had access to make these kinds of transactions?" she asked. "That's where things get really interesting." Martha said, producing another set of documents. All of the suspicious transactions were authorized by someone with executive-level access to the company accounts. There were only 3 people with that authority. Jacob and Elena waited for the revelation they both sensed was coming. Thomas, his mother Carmen, and the company's chief financial officer, David Patterson. Elena felt the pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. David Patterson was Carmen's recommendation for CFO. Thomas wasn't sure about hiring him, but Carmen insisted he was qualified. "How well did you know Patterson?" Jacob asked. "Barely at all. He started working for the company about 6 months before I married Thomas." Carmen said he came highly recommended from another construction firm in Denver. Martha smiled grimly. "I checked into Patterson's background. The firm in Denver has never heard of him. His references were fabricated, his credentials falsified. David Patterson doesn't exist, at least not as the person Carmen claimed he was." The implications were staggering. Elena realized that Carmen had essentially brought a professional thief into the company and given him access to millions of dollars in assets. So Carmen was either incredibly naive or actively involved in the embezzlement, Jacob observed. Given her subsequent behavior toward Elena, "I'd lean toward active involvement," Martha replied. "Think about it. If Carmen was stealing from her own family's company, she'd need someone to blame when the theft was eventually discovered." Elena felt sick as the full scope of Carmen's plan became clear. She was setting Thomas up to take the blame. When the embezzlement came to light, she could claim that Thomas was the thief and that she was an innocent victim. "But Thomas discovered the truth before she could execute her plan," Jacob added, "so she had to eliminate him." Martha nodded soberly. "And when Thomas changed his will to leave everything to Elena, Carmen had to find a new scapegoat. Elena became the perfect target, an outsider with no family connections or resources to fight back." Elena stood up abruptly, pacing to the window as she processed the revelation that her mother-in-law had likely murdered her own son to cover up financial crimes. The woman who'd accused Elena of being a gold digger was herself a thief, who'd stolen millions from her own family's business. "Can we prove any of this?" Elena asked, her voice tight with emotion. "That's the challenge," Martha admitted. "Most of what I've gathered is circumstantial evidence and hearsay. We need concrete proof that would stand up in court." Jacob studied. The documents spread across the table, his mind working through the legal implications. What about Thomas's investigation? If he discovered the embezzlement, he might have documented his findings. "I've been thinking about that," Elena said slowly. "Thomas had a home office where he worked on company business. After his death, Carmen insisted on clearing it out herself. She said she needed to secure confidential business documents." "Did you see what she took?" Martha asked. "No, she did it while I was at the funeral home making arrangements. When I got home, the office was completely empty. Carmen said she donated everything to charity, but that never made sense to me." Jacob felt a surge of anger at Carmen's audacity. She destroyed the evidence that would have exposed her crimes and implicated her in Thomas's death. "Maybe not all of it," Elena said thoughtfully. "Thomas was paranoid about computer security. He always made backup copies of important files and stored them in different locations." Martha leaned forward with interest. "What kind of backup locations?" "He had a safety deposit box at the bank that Carmen doesn't know about. And he sometimes left copies of sensitive documents with his friend Marcus Webb, who's a lawyer in town." Jacob felt hope building for the first time since Martha had begun sharing her discoveries. "Those backups might contain the evidence we need to prove Carmen's involvement in the embezzlement and possibly Thomas's murder." "There's just one problem," Elena said with a worried expression. "Marcus Webb was Thomas's friend, not mine. He barely knows me, and he might not believe my story about Carmen." "Then we'll have to convince him," Martha replied with determination. "If those documents exist, They're our best chance of protecting Hope and bringing Carmen to justice." Jacob stood up, his mind already working through the logistics of contacting Marcus Webb without alerting Carmen to their investigation. What do we know about this lawyer? Can we trust him? Elena considered the question carefully. Marcus is a good man, very ethical. He and Thomas were friends since college. If anyone would want to see justice for Thomas's death, it would be Marcus. But approaching him will be risky, Martha pointed out. If he doesn't believe our story, he might contact Carmen or the authorities. It's a risk we have to take, Jacob said firmly. Elena and Hope can't spend their lives running from false accusations. We need to end this one way or another. The next phase of their plan took shape over the following hours. Jacob would travel to Harmony Falls under the pretense of conducting business, giving him cover to approach Marcus Webb without raising suspicions. Elena would remain at the ranch with Hope, maintaining her new identity as Martha's niece in case anyone came looking for her. "I don't like the idea of you going there alone," Elena said as they finalized the arrangements. "If Carmen finds out what you're doing, she could have you arrested or worse." Jacob appreciated Elena's concern, but his mind was made up. "I'll be careful. And if Marcus Webb has those documents, it'll be worth the risk." Martha pulled out a business card and handed it to Jacob. "My cousin at the courthouse gave me this. Marcus Webb's office address and phone number. She says he's been practicing law in Harmony Falls for over 20 years and has a reputation for integrity." Jacob studied the card, memorizing the information. "How should I approach him? I can't just walk into his office and accuse Carmen Rodriguez of murder." "Start with the embezzlement," Martha suggested. "Show him the financial evidence we've gathered and explain that Elena is being framed for crimes she didn't commit. If he has Thomas's documents, the truth should speak for itself." Elena reached into her purse and pulled out her wedding ring, which she'd continued wearing despite everything that had happened. "Take this," she said, placing the ring in Jacob's hand. "Show it to Marcus. He'll recognize it. Thomas had it specially made with his grandmother's diamond. Marcus was there when Thomas proposed." Jacob felt the weight of the ring in his palm, understanding the trust Elena was placing in him. The simple band represented not just her marriage to Thomas, but her faith that justice was possible. "I'll bring it back to you," he promised. "Along with the evidence we need to end this nightmare." That evening, as Jacob prepared for his journey to Harmony Falls, Elena found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed since she'd collapsed at his gate 5 weeks earlier. She'd arrived as a desperate, frightened woman, fleeing false accusations. Now she was part of a family that was actively fighting for justice, supported by people who believed in her innocence. "Are you scared?" she asked Jacob as they stood on the porch, watching the sun set over the Montana plains. "Terrified," Jacob admitted. "But not Carmen Rodriguez or her hired thugs. I'm scared of letting you and Hope down, of failing to get the evidence we need." Elena took his hand, squeezing it gently. "You won't fail. You're the strongest, most honorable man I've ever known. If anyone can convince Marcus to help us, it's you." Jacob felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. 5 weeks ago, he'd been a broken man consumed by grief and bitterness. Elena's faith in him had helped him rediscover strength he'd thought was lost forever. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know something," he said, turning to face her directly. "Helping you and Hope has been the most important thing I've done since Sarah died. You've given me a purpose again, a reason to believe in something beyond my own pain." Elena felt tears welling in her eyes. "You saved our lives, Jacob. Both. Literally and figuratively. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You already have," Jacob replied softly. "You trusted me when you had no reason to. You let me be part of Hope's life when I thought I'd never have a family again. That's more than repayment. That's a gift." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Hope was sleeping peacefully in the house behind them, safe and loved despite the uncertainty that surrounded her future. "Promise me something," Elena said finally. "Anything. Promise me that whatever Marcus Webb tells you tomorrow, whatever evidence we find or don't find, you won't blame yourself if things don't work out. You've already done more than anyone could ask." Jacob considered her request, understanding the fear behind it. Elena had learned not to expect happy endings, to prepare for disappointment even while hoping for justice. "I promise," he said. "But I also promise that I won't give up until Carmen Rodriguez pays for what she's done. To Thomas, to you, and to Hope." Elena smiled through her tears. "That's all I can ask for." The next morning, Jacob set out for Harmony Falls before dawn, carrying Elena's wedding ring and Martha's carefully assembled evidence. The 6-hour drive gave him time to rehearse his approach to Marcus Webb, to consider various scenarios and prepare for different reactions. As he crossed the state line into the territory where Carmen Rodriguez wielded her influence, Jacob felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Elena and Hope were counting on him to return with evidence that could protect them from a woman who'd already committed murder to cover her crimes. The landscape gradually changed from Montana's rolling plains to the more densely populated valleys of central Colorado. Harmony Falls sat nestled between two mountain ranges, a prosperous-looking town that bore the marks of successful commerce and careful civic planning. Jacob drove through the main business district, noting the Rodriguez construction signs on several buildings under renovation. Carmen's family business was clearly a significant presence in the local economy, which explained her political influence and social standing. Marcus Webb's law office occupied a brick building near the courthouse, with a small parking lot and a professional sign that suggested a successful but not ostentatious practice. Jacob sat in his truck for several minutes, gathering his courage for what might be the most important conversation of his life. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and graying hair, greeted him with professional courtesy when he entered the office. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Webb about a legal matter involving Thomas Rodriguez," Jacob said, hoping that Thomas's name would ensure immediate attention. The receptionist's expression grew somber. "Mr. Webb is available." He was very close to Thomas. "May I tell him who's asking?" "Jacob Matthews. I'm here on behalf of Thomas's widow, Elena." The receptionist disappeared into the inner office, returning moments later with Marcus Webb himself. The lawyer was a man in his 40s, with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with serious legal matters. "Mr. Matthews? I'm Marcus Webb. Please come into my office. I understand you're here about Elena Rodriguez." Jacob followed the lawyer into a comfortable office lined with law books and legal certificates. Marcus gestured for him to sit in a leather chair across from a mahogany desk that spoke of professional success and established clientele. "I have to say, I've been wondering about Elena's whereabouts," Marcus began. "Carmen Rodriguez has been telling people some very disturbing stories about her daughter-in-law's mental state and possible involvement in Thomas's death." Jacob pulled Elena's wedding ring from his pocket and placed it on Marcus's desk. "Elena asked me to show you this. She said you'd recognize it." Marcus picked up the ring, examining the distinctive setting with obvious recognition. "This is definitely Elena's ring. Thomas had it specially made with his grandmother's diamond. Where is Elena? Is she all right?" "She's safe for now, but she's in serious danger, and I believe you might have information that could help protect her." Over the next hour, Jacob laid out everything they discovered about the embezzlement at Rodriguez Construction, Carmen's likely involvement in Thomas's death, and the false accusations being leveled against Elena. He presented Martha's evidence methodically, watching Marcus's expression grow increasingly grave as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. "This is all very disturbing," Marcus said when Jacob finished his presentation. And unfortunately, it aligns with some concerns Thomas shared with me in the weeks before his death. Jacob felt his heart race with anticipation. What kind of concerns? Marcus walked to a filing cabinet and withdrew a sealed envelope that he placed on his desk between them. Thomas brought me this envelope 3 days before he died. He said he'd discovered something terrible about his family's business and asked me to keep these documents safe. He seemed genuinely frightened, said he wasn't sure who he could trust. Jacob stared at the envelope, hardly daring to hope that it contained the evidence they desperately needed. "Have you opened it?" he asked. "No, Thomas asked me to keep it. Sealed unless something happened to him. After his death, I almost opened it several times, but Carmen's accusations against Elena made me cautious. I wasn't sure what to believe." Jacob leaned forward urgently. "Mr. Webb, Elena is innocent. She loved Thomas deeply, and she's being framed by the real criminals. Whatever's in that envelope might be the only thing that can save her and protect her baby." Marcus studied Jacob's face carefully, seeming to weigh his sincerity against the seriousness of the accusations. "You really believe Carmen Rodriguez killed her own son?" he asked. "I believe Carmen Rodriguez is capable of anything to protect herself and her stolen money," Jacob replied firmly. "And I believe Thomas died because he discovered her crimes." Marcus picked up the envelope, turning it over in his hands as he made his decision. "Thomas was my friend," he said finally. "If there's even a chance that Elena is innocent and his real killers are walking free, then I owe it to his memory to find out the truth." With deliberate movements, Marcus broke the seal on the envelope and withdrew its contents. Inside were bank records, copies of fraudulent invoices, photographs of empty job sites that had been billed for expensive equipment, and a handwritten letter in Thomas's distinctive script. Marcus read the letter silently, his expression growing darker with each line. When he finished, he looked up at Jacob with eyes that reflected both sorrow and determination. "Thomas knew," Marcus said simply. "He'd figured out the entire embezzlement scheme, identified the participants, and documented everything. This letter, it's essentially his will and testament, written because he feared for his life." Jacob felt a surge of vindication, mixed with grief for a man he'd never met, but had come to respect through Elena's stories. "What does he say?" Marcus cleared his throat and began reading from Thomas's letter. "If you're reading this, Marcus, then something has happened to me, and my fears about my mother and David Patterson were justified. I've discovered that they've been systematically stealing from Rodriguez Construction for over 2 years, using fraudulent contracts and non-existent subcontractors to funnel money into offshore accounts." The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing every aspect of the embezzlement scheme and Thomas's growing realization that his mother viewed him as an obstacle to her plans. Most damning of all was Thomas's final paragraph. "I confronted my mother tonight about the evidence I've gathered. She didn't deny the theft, but she made it clear that she won't allow me to expose her crimes. She said the family business is more important than any individual family member, including me. I'm changing my will tomorrow to protect Elena and our unborn child, but I fear that decision may have sealed my fate. If something happens to me, please ensure that Elena receives these documents and knows that I loved her until the very end." Marcus set down the letter with hands that trembled slightly. Dear God, Thomas knew his mother was planning to kill him. Jacob felt a mixture of triumph and tragedy as he realized they now had the evidence needed to expose Carmen's crimes and protect Elena, but the victory felt hollow in the face of Thomas's murder and the grief that Elena would feel when she learned the full truth about her husband's death. "Will you help us?" Jacob asked. "Will you help Elena get justice for Thomas and protection for their daughter?" Marcus looked at the documents spread across his desk, representing the final testimony of a murdered friend and the hope for justice. That had seemed impossible just hours before. "I'll do more than help," Marcus said with quiet determination. I'll make sure Carmen Rodriguez and David Patterson pay for what they've done. And I'll ensure that Elena and her baby are safe from any further persecution. Jacob felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he realized their long shot had paid off. Elena's faith in him had been justified, and Hope would grow up knowing that her father had been a good man who died trying to protect his family from evil. The real battle was just beginning, but for the first time since Elena had collapsed at his gate, Jacob felt confident that justice would prevail. Thomas Rodriguez would finally get the vindication he deserved, and his wife and daughter would be free to build the life he'd wanted them to have. Carmen Rodriguez's reign of terror was about to come to an end, and the truth that Thomas had died protecting was finally going to see the light of day. Jacob's return journey to Montana felt like traveling through a different world. The sealed manila envelope containing Thomas's evidence sat beside him on the passenger seat, its contents representing both vindication for Elena and a death warrant for Carmen Rodriguez's carefully constructed lies. Every mile brought him closer to a confrontation that would determine not just Elena and Hope's future, but potentially expose one of the most calculated family murders in Colorado's recent history. The evidence Marcus Webb had entrusted to him was more comprehensive than Jacob had dared hope. Beyond Thomas's devastating letter, the envelope contained bank statements showing the systematic transfer of company funds to offshore accounts, photographs of construction sites where expensive equipment had been built but never delivered, and most damning of all, email exchanges between Carmen Rodriguez and the man calling himself David Patterson that clearly indicated their joint involvement in the embezzlement scheme. One particular email chain had made Jacob's blood run cold. In it, Carmen discussed eliminating obstacles to the business restructuring and referenced permanent solutions to family loyalty problems. The correspondence was dated just 2 weeks before Thomas's death, suggesting that Carmen had been planning her son's murder for some time before executing it. As Jacob crossed back into Montana, his cell phone rang with a call from Martha that immediately put him on high alert. "Jacob, thank God you're answering." Martha's voice carried an urgency that made him pull over to the side of the highway. "We have a problem. Elena spotted surveillance vehicles near the ranch this morning. Professional types, not local law enforcement." Jacob felt his stomach drop. How many vehicles? Did they approach the house? 2 black SUVs with tinted windows, parked about a mile down the access road. They've been there for hours, just watching. Elena's terrified they're going to storm the property and take Hope. "I'm still 3 hours out," Jacob said, his mind racing through contingency plans. "Can you get Elena and the baby somewhere safe? That's what I'm calling about. I think it's time to implement the emergency relocation plan we discussed. My cabin up in the mountains. It's isolated, well-stocked, and completely off the grid. Elena and Hope could hide there while we deal with this situation." Jacob agreed immediately. They'd prepared for this possibility, knowing that Carmen's investigators would eventually track Elena to the ranch. The mountain cabin represented their last line of defense before they'd have to consider fleeing the state entirely. "Get them out of there now," Jacob instructed. "I'll meet you at the cabin as soon as I can. And Martha, we got the evidence. Everything we need to destroy Carmen Rodriguez and prove Elena's innocence." "Thank the Lord," Martha breathed. "That couldn't have come at a better time. I'll call you once Elena and Hope are safely relocated." Jacob ended the call and pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing his truck to its limits as he raced toward what felt like the final showdown with a woman who'd already proven she would kill to protect her secrets. The mountain cabin Martha had mentioned was a rustic structure built by her late husband 40 years earlier as a hunting retreat. Located 20 miles from the nearest paved road and accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through dense forest, it offered the kind of isolation that made surveillance nearly impossible. More importantly, it was completely unknown to anyone outside Martha's immediate family. making it the perfect hideout for Elena and Hope while they prepared their legal counterattack. Jacob arrived at the cabin just as the sun was setting behind the mountain peaks, casting long shadows through the pine trees that surrounded the modest log structure. Elena's relief at seeing him was palpable as she rushed out to meet him, carrying Hope in her arms. "I was so scared they'd found us," she sighed, her voice shaking with residual fear. Those men looked like professionals, the kind Carmen would hire to handle her dirty work. Jacob embraced both Elena and Hope, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. These two people had become his family, and he would do whatever it took to protect them from Carmen's reach. "They haven't found us," he assured Elena. "And after tonight, Carmen Rodriguez is going to have much bigger problems to worry about than tracking you down." Inside the cabin, Martha had prepared a warm meal and created a comfortable environment for what might be their final strategy session. The main room featured a stone fireplace, comfortable furniture, and oil lamps that provided warm light without the need for electricity that might reveal their location to anyone monitoring power grids. Jacob spread Thomas's documents across the wooden dining table, watching Elena's face as she saw for the first time the full scope of her late husband's investigation into his mother's crimes. The evidence was overwhelming: bank records, fraudulent contracts, email exchanges, and most heartbreaking of all, Thomas's handwritten letter detailing his fears about his mother's plans. "He knew," Elena whispered as she read Thomas's final words. "He knew Carmen was planning to kill him, and he tried to protect us anyway." Jacob watched tears stream down Elena's face as she processed the revelation that her husband had died not in a random accident, but as the victim of a calculated murder orchestrated by his own mother. The grief was devastating, but Jacob could also see anger building in Elena's eyes, a righteous fury that would fuel their fight for justice. "Thomas was a good man who died trying to protect his family," Jacob said gently. "Now it's our turn to finish what he started." Martha had been studying the financial documents with the sharp eye of someone who'd spent decades managing budgets and analyzing complex information. "The embezzlement is even worse than we initially thought," she reported. "According to these bank records, Carmen and Patterson have stolen nearly $3 million over the past 2.5 years. They've essentially bankrupted Rodriguez Construction while making it appear profitable on paper." Elena looked up from Thomas's letter with confusion. But how is that possible? The company was still getting new contracts, still completing projects. How could it be bankrupt? Ponzi scheme, Jacob realized, his experience with ranch finances helping him understand the mechanism. They were using money from new contracts to pay the bills from previous jobs, while skimming the profits into their offshore accounts. As long as new business kept coming in, they could maintain the illusion of prosperity. But that kind of scheme has to collapse eventually, Martha pointed out. What was their endgame? Jacob studied the email exchanges between Carmen and Patterson, noting references to exit strategies and asset liquidation plans that painted a disturbing picture of their ultimate intentions. They were planning to disappear, he concluded. Once they'd stolen everything of value, they would have blamed the company's collapse on mismanagement by Thomas, taken their offshore money, and started new lives somewhere beyond the reach of U.S. law enforcement. Elena felt sick as she realized how thoroughly Carmen had planned to destroy not just Thomas, but the entire family legacy his grandfather had built over decades of honest work. She was going to let Thomas take the blame for bankrupting the company. That's been in his family for 3 generations, Elena said with growing anger. She would have destroyed his reputation along with everything else. But Thomas figured it out before she could complete her plan, Martha observed. When he changed his will to leave everything to Elena, he forced Carmen to accelerate her timeline. Jacob nodded grimly. Carmen couldn't afford to let Thomas expose her crimes or transfer ownership of the company to Elena. She had to eliminate him before he could act on what he'd discovered. The full scope of Carmen's betrayal was staggering in its calculated cruelty. She'd murdered her own son to protect stolen money, then attempted to frame his pregnant widow for the crime to ensure there would be no further investigation into the company's finances. "What's our next move?" Elena asked, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil she was clearly experiencing. Jacob had been thinking about their strategy during his drive from Harmony Falls, and Thomas's evidence had confirmed his initial instincts about the best way to proceed. "We take this evidence to the FBI," he said. "This isn't just a local murder case anymore. It's interstate financial fraud involving millions of dollars. Federal authorities will have the resources and jurisdiction to pursue Carmen regardless of her local political connections." Martha agreed with the strategy but raised an important practical concern. "Federal investigations take time, and Carmen's people are getting closer to finding Elena. We need to protect you both until the authorities can take her into custody." Elena looked around the cabin that had become their temporary sanctuary, understanding that even this remote hideout might not remain secure indefinitely. "How long do you think we have?" she asked. "Maybe a few days," Jacob estimated. "Carmen's investigators are thorough, and they'll eventually expand their search to include properties owned by Martha's family. We need to move quickly." Over the next several hours, they refined their plan with the precision of military strategists preparing for a crucial battle. Jacob would contact the FBI field office in Denver first thing in the morning using Marcus Webb's credentials as Thomas's attorney to ensure their evidence received immediate attention. Martha would coordinate with her contacts in local law enforcement to ensure Elena's safety once federal authorities took over the case. Elena's role would be the most difficult. She would need to prepare herself for intensive questioning by federal agents, media attention once Carmen's arrest became public, and the emotional challenge of testifying against her late husband's mother in what would likely be a highly publicized trial. "Are you ready for that?" Jacob asked gently. "Facing Carmen in court, having your private life examined by lawyers and reporters?" Elena looked down at Hope, who was sleeping peacefully in her carrier, blissfully unaware of the adult drama surrounding her young life. "I'm ready," Elena said with quiet determination. "Hope deserves to know the truth about her father, and Carmen Rodriguez needs to pay for what she's done. Thomas died trying to protect us. The least I can do is see that his sacrifice wasn't in vain." As the night wore on, their conversation turned to more personal matters. What would happen after Carmen's arrest, where Elena and Hope would live, and how they would rebuild their lives once the legal proceedings were complete. "You'll always have a place at the ranch," Jacob said. "Both of you. It's become home for all of us." Elena smiled through her tears. "I'd like that. Hope should grow up somewhere with space to run and explore, somewhere she can learn about the kind of man her father really was." Martha watched the interaction between Jacob and Elena with the knowing eyes of someone who'd observed human relationships for over 70 years. What had started as a desperate stranger seeking shelter had evolved into something much deeper, a family bound together by shared trials and mutual commitment to justice. "You know," Martha said thoughtfully, "I've delivered a lot of babies over the years, and I've learned that families aren't always defined by blood relationships. Sometimes the strongest bonds are forged by people who choose to stand together when it really matters." Jacob felt the truth of Martha's words resonate in his chest. His relationship with Elena and Hope had grown into something that transcended their original circumstances. They'd become his family in every way that mattered, and he couldn't imagine his life without them. The next morning brought both hope and danger in equal measure. Jacob's call to the FBI Denver field office resulted in an immediate request for a meeting, with federal agents expressing serious interest in the evidence against Carmen Rodriguez. The Financial Crimes Unit had apparently been tracking suspicious activity related to construction industry money laundering, and Thomas's documents provided crucial missing pieces to their investigation. However, Martha's morning reconnaissance revealed that Carmen's surveillance teams had expanded their search and were now systematically checking properties throughout the region. The mountain cabin remained undiscovered, but it was only a matter of time before their sanctuary would be compromised. "We need to get Elena and Hope to the FBI office today," Jacob concluded after weighing their options. "It's the only way to ensure their safety while the federal investigation moves forward." The journey to Denver would be risky, requiring them to travel through areas where Carmen's people might be watching for Elena. But staying hidden in the mountains while federal agents prepared their case would be even more dangerous. As Carmen's resources seemed virtually unlimited, Elena surprised Jacob with her composure as they prepared for what might be their final flight from Carmen's reach. "I'm tired of running," she said as she packed Hope's supplies for the journey. "Whatever happens in Denver, at least we'll be fighting back instead of just hiding." Jacob admired Elena's courage, even as he worried about the dangers they would face once their location became known to federal authorities and, inevitably, to Carmen Rodriguez herself. The drive to Denver took place in convoy formation, with Martha leading in her pickup truck to scout for potential surveillance, Jacob and Elena following in his vehicle with Hope, and Marcus Webb bringing up the rear in his own car after flying in from Harmony Falls to provide legal support during Elena's FBI interview. The landscape changed gradually from Montana's rugged mountains to Colorado's more developed valleys, with each mile bringing them closer to a confrontation that would determine whether Carmen Rodriguez would finally face justice for her crimes. Elena spent much of the journey rehearsing her testimony, reviewing the timeline of events that had led to Thomas's death and her subsequent flight from Harmony Falls. Jacob could see the emotional toll the preparation was taking on her, but he also noticed a growing strength and determination that reminded him of the courage she'd shown during Hope's difficult birth. "Whatever happens in that FBI office," Jacob said as they approached Denver's skyline, "remember that you're not alone. You have people who believe in you, who will fight for you no matter what Carmen tries to do." Elena reached over and took his hand, squeezing it with a gratitude that needed no words. The pregnant widow who'd collapsed at his gate 7 weeks earlier had been transformed by their shared experiences into a woman ready to face her demons and fight for her daughter's future. The FBI field office was an imposing glass and steel structure that spoke of federal authority and serious law enforcement capabilities. As they walked through the security checkpoints and metal detectors, Elena felt both intimidation and relief at finally having the protection of legitimate authorities. Special Agent Rebecca Chen, the lead investigator for financial crimes, met them in a conference room lined with whiteboards and equipped with recording equipment. Agent Chen was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and the confident manner of someone who'd spent years pursuing complex white-collar criminals. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Agent Chen began, "we've reviewed the evidence your attorney provided, and I want you to know that we take these allegations very seriously. The financial fraud case against Carmen Rodriguez and David Patterson is already being prepared, but we need your testimony to establish the murder conspiracy." Over the next 4 hours, Elena provided detailed testimony about her relationship with Thomas, his growing concerns about the company's finances, his fears about his mother's reaction to his investigation, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding his death. Agent Chen asked probing questions designed to test Elena's credibility and establish a timeline that would support federal charges. Marcus Webb provided crucial corroboration, sharing his memories of Thomas's increasing anxiety in the weeks before his death and the circumstances under which Thomas had entrusted him with the sealed envelope of evidence. "Based on what you've told us and the documentary evidence you've provided," Agent Chen concluded, "we have sufficient grounds to seek federal arrest warrants for Carmen Rodriguez and David Patterson on charges of wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and interstate racketeering. The murder charges will need to be pursued by Colorado state authorities, but our investigation will provide them with the evidence they need. Elena felt a surge of relief and vindication as she realized that Carmen's reign of terror was finally coming to an end. The woman who'd murdered Thomas and tried to frame her for the crime would soon face the full weight of federal law enforcement. How long before the arrests? Jacob asked. Within 48 hours, Agent Chun replied. We'll coordinate with Colorado authorities to ensure both suspects are taken into custody simultaneously, preventing either one from fleeing or destroying additional evidence. As they prepared to leave the FBI office, Agent Chun provided Elena with contact information for witness protection services and assured her that federal marshals would provide security until Carmen and Patterson were safely in custody. Mrs. Rodriguez, Agent Chun said as they concluded the meeting, I want you to know that your courage in coming forward has potentially saved other families from experiencing what you've been through. Financial predators like Carmen Rodriguez rarely stop with one victim. Your willingness to fight back will protect others. Elena felt pride mixing with her relief as she realized that her decision to trust Jacob and Martha, to fight rather than flee, had led to something larger than just personal vindication. Carmen's arrest would end a criminal enterprise that had already claimed multiple victims and would have continued destroying lives if left unchecked. The journey back to Montana felt different than their trip to Denver, where they'd traveled south in fear and uncertainty. They now returned with the protection of federal authorities and the knowledge that justice was finally within reach. Hope seemed to sense the change in her mother's mood, babbling happily in her car seat as they drove through the mountain passes that led home to Jacob's ranch. The baby who'd been born into crisis and uncertainty would now grow up knowing that her father had been a hero who died protecting his family from evil. What happens now? Elena asked as they approached the familiar landmarks near Cedar Creek. Now, we wait for Carmen to be arrested, Jacob replied. And then we start building the life Thomas wanted you and hoped to have. Elena smiled at the thought of a future free from fear and persecution. The pregnant widow who'd collapsed at Jacob's gate had been transformed by their shared experiences into a woman ready to embrace new possibilities and build a family with the man who'd saved her life. The ranch that had once been Jacob's refuge from the world had become something much more important, a home where love could heal old wounds and where justice could triumph over greed and betrayal. As they pulled into the familiar driveway, Elena realized that the journey that had begun with Thomas's murder and her desperate flight would end with the creation of something beautiful and lasting. Carmen Rodriguez's crimes would soon be exposed. But more importantly, Elena and Jacob had discovered that even the darkest circumstances could lead to hope and redemption when people chose to stand together against injustice. Their love story had been forged in crisis, but it would endure long after their enemies had been brought to justice. The pregnant widow's collapse at Jacob's gate had been the beginning of both their salvation and Carmen Rodriguez's downfall. Now, as they prepared for the final phase of their battle, Elena knew that whatever the future held, she would face it with the support of a man who'd proven that true strength came from protecting others rather than pursuing selfish interests. Hope's future was finally secure, and Elena's long nightmare was about to end. The truth that Thomas had died protecting would finally see the light of day, and his sacrifice would be vindicated through the federal prosecution of the woman who'd betrayed everything he'd believed in about family loyalty and moral obligation. Carmen Rodriguez had underestimated the power of truth and the courage of people fighting for justice. Her calculated cruelty had created the very enemies who would ultimately destroy her, and her victim's widow would live to see that justice was finally served. 5 years had passed since Elena collapsed at Jacob's gate during that fateful storm, and the ranch that had once been a monument to grief had become a beacon of hope for families across the nation. The Thomas Rodriguez Justice Foundation now operated from a beautiful facility built on the eastern portion of Jacob's property. Its modern offices and conference rooms, a testament to how far they'd come from those desperate early days of hiding and fear. Elena stood at the window of her office, watching Hope play in the Foundation's children's area with the sons and daughters of other families who'd sought their help. At 6 years old, Hope was a confident, joyful child who spoke fluent Spanish and English, rode horses with fearless enthusiasm, and showed an early interest in helping others that reminded Elena powerfully of Thomas's compassionate nature. Foundation had grown beyond Elena's wildest dreams, now employing over 30 staff members including lawyers, investigators, counselors, and administrative support personnel. They'd assisted more than 200 families in cases ranging from corporate fraud to domestic financial abuse, achieving an 85% success rate in securing justice for their clients. Jacob entered Elena's office carrying 2 cups of coffee and the satisfied expression of someone who'd just finished a particularly productive meeting. "The Patterson Foundation just approved our grant request," he announced, settling into the chair across from Elena's desk. "We'll have funding for the new whistleblower protection program." Elena smiled at the irony that David Patterson's cooperation with federal prosecutors had led to a plea agreement, requiring him to establish a foundation focused on corporate crime prevention. Patterson's foundation regularly funded programs like theirs, creating a situation where the former criminal was now inadvertently supporting efforts to catch others like himself. "How much?" Elena asked. $3 million over 3 years. "Enough to expand our legal team and establish satellite offices in Phoenix and Atlanta." Elena felt the familiar surge of excitement that came with each expansion of their ability to help families in crisis. The foundation had become her life's work, but more than that, it had become a living memorial to Thomas that grew stronger and more impactful each year. "Martha called this morning," Elena continued, updating Jacob on their extended family's activities. "She wants to bring her new foster daughter by next week. Apparently, the girl's family was targeted by an insurance fraud scheme, and Martha thinks we might be able to help." At 78, Martha Hayes continued to serve as the Foundation's chief advocate and grandmother figure to Hope. Her decision to become a foster parent for children from troubled families had surprised everyone, but Martha's explanation was characteristically practical. "I've got wisdom to share and love to give. Might as well put them to good use." Jacob reviewed the files spread across Elena's desk, noting the diversity of cases they were currently handling. A military family being defrauded by a housing contractor in Texas, a small business owner whose accounting firm had embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars in California, an elderly couple in Florida whose adult children were systematically stealing their retirement savings. "Each case reminds me of our own story," Elena observed, watching Jacob study the files. Ordinary people being victimized by those they trusted, feeling powerless against wealth and influence. "The difference is that now they have somewhere to turn," Jacob replied. "They don't have to face it alone like you did." Elena thought about the hundreds of thank you letters they'd received over the years from families whose lives had been transformed by the Foundation's intervention. Each letter represented not just a legal victory, but a family that could sleep peacefully knowing that justice was possible, even for those without power or resources. The Foundation's success had brought unexpected recognition, including a presidential award for excellence in community service that Elena had accepted at the White House the previous year. Standing in the Oval Office with Hope beside her, Elena had felt Thomas's presence strongly, as if he was finally seeing the good that had emerged from his tragic death. "Mommy, can we go riding after lunch?" Hope asked, bursting into the office with the boundless energy of a 6-year-old who'd been sitting still too long. "Of course, sweetheart," Elena replied, lifting Hope onto her lap. "Did you finish your lessons with Mrs. Patterson?" Hope nodded enthusiastically. Mrs. Patterson was their live-in tutor, a retired teacher who'd moved to the ranch to provide Hope with personalized education while allowing Elena and Jacob to maintain their demanding work schedule. She taught me about butterflies today, Hope explained. Did you know they start as caterpillars and completely change into something beautiful? Elena exchanged a meaningful glance with Jacob, both recognizing the metaphor in Hope's innocent observation. Their own transformation from victims to advocates had been similarly dramatic, though far more complicated than a butterfly's metamorphosis. That's called transformation, Elena explained to Hope. Sometimes the most beautiful things come from the most difficult beginnings. Hope considered this with the serious expression she wore when processing new concepts, like how Daddy Thomas died. But then our foundation helps other families so they don't have to be sad. Elena felt tears spring to her eyes at Hope's mature understanding of their family story. Despite her young age, Hope had absorbed the values that drove the foundation's work and understood that her father's death had meaning beyond the tragedy itself. Exactly like that, Elena confirmed, hugging her daughter tightly. Your daddy would be very proud of how we've honored his memory. That afternoon, as promised, Elena and Hope went horseback riding through the Montana countryside that had become their permanent home. Hope rode her own pony, a gentle mare named Buttercup that Jacob had trained specifically for a child rider, while Elena accompanied her on Thunder, the horse that had replaced Jacob's aging mount from their early days together. The landscape around them showed signs of the ranch's prosperity and growth. New fencing enclosed expanded pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. A modern barn housed the horses and farm equipment needed to maintain their agricultural operations. Gardens, designed by Elena, provided fresh vegetables for their household and beautiful flowers that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. Tell me the story again, Hope requested as they rode along the familiar trail that led to their favorite picnic spot beside a clear mountain stream. Elena knew exactly which story Hope wanted to hear, the tale of how she'd arrived at the ranch during a terrible storm and how Jacob had saved both their lives through his kindness and courage. It was a dark and stormy night, Elena began, using the dramatic tone that always delighted Hope. I was very scared and alone, carrying you in my tummy, when I saw the lights of Uncle Jacob's house. Elena had adapted the story for Hope's young ears, emphasizing the themes of kindness, courage, and justice while avoiding the more frightening details of Carmen's pursuit and Thomas's murder. Hope would learn the complete truth when she was older, but for now, the simplified version provided important lessons about helping others and standing up for what was right. And then Uncle Jacob became my daddy, Hope concluded, as she always did when Elena finished the story. That's right, Elena confirmed. Sometimes families are created by love and choice, not just by blood. They reached their destination and dismounted to enjoy the lunch Elena had packed in her saddlebags. The peaceful sound of flowing water and birdsong provided a soundtrack for their conversation about Hope's studies, her friends at the foundation, and her plans for her upcoming 7th birthday party. Can we invite all the kids whose families we've helped? Hope asked, referring to the growing network of children connected to the foundation's work. That's a wonderful idea, Elena agreed. We'll need a big cake to feed everyone. As they prepared to return to the ranch, Elena received a call on her satellite phone from Marcus Webb, who now served as the foundation's chief legal counsel while maintaining his practice in Harmony Falls. Elena, I have news about the Williamson case, Marcus reported, his excitement evident even through the phone's speaker. The jury just returned a guilty verdict on all counts. The insurance company executives will each serve at least 10 years. And the family will receive full restitution plus punitive damages. Elena felt the familiar satisfaction that came with each successful case, but also the soberness that accompanied any reminder of the suffering families endured before finding help. How's Mrs. Williamson handling the news? Elena asked. Better than expected. She said to tell you that knowing her husband's death wasn't in vain has brought her more peace than she thought possible. Elena understood Mrs. Williamson's feelings completely. The knowledge that Thomas's death had prevented other families from experiencing similar tragedies had been crucial to Elena's own healing process. As they rode back to the ranch, Elena reflected on the unexpected path her life had taken since that desperate night when she'd collapsed at Jacob's gate. The frightened, pregnant widow fleeing false accusations had evolved into a nationally recognized advocate for justice whose work had changed hundreds of lives. That evening, the family gathered for dinner in the ranch house's expanded dining room, which could now accommodate the various guests and staff members who regularly joined them for meals. Tonight's group included Martha and her current foster daughter, a shy 12-year-old named Sophia, whose family had been victimized by an employment scam that left them destitute. Sophia's father was promised construction work in Nevada, Martha explained as they shared Elena's homemade lasagna. The company took his deposit for tools and transportation, then disappeared. Family lost their savings and had to move in with relatives. Elena studied Sophia's withdrawn expression, recognizing the signs of a child whose sense of security had been shattered by adult failures beyond her understanding. "We'll help your family," Elena assured Sophia gently. "That's what we do here. We help families get justice when bad people try to hurt them." Sophia nodded solemnly, not yet ready to believe that help was possible, but beginning to hope that the kind adults around her might be different from those who betrayed her families. Trust. After dinner, Elena tucked Hope into bed in the nursery that had once been prepared for her and Sarah's child. The room had been redecorated multiple times as Hope grew, but it retained the warm, loving atmosphere Sarah had envisioned for her own baby. "Mommy," Hope said as Elena read her bedtime story, "why do bad people hurt good families?" It was a question Elena had wrestled with herself many times, especially during the darkest days of their ordeal with Carmen Rodriguez. "I don't know why bad people make the choices they do," Elena answered honestly. "But I know that good people like you and Uncle Jacob and Martha can help fix the hurt that bad people cause." "Is that why we have the foundation?" "That's exactly why we have the foundation. We turn our own hurt into help for other people." Hope seemed satisfied with this explanation and drifted off to sleep holding the stuffed horse Jacob had given her for her 5th birthday. Elena stood in the doorway for a few moments, watching her daughter's peaceful expression and feeling grateful for the stability and love that now defined their lives. Later, Elena and Jacob walked hand in hand around the property, checking on the horses and enjoying the quiet companionship that had become one of their greatest pleasures. The foundation's offices were dark, except for security lighting, and the ranch felt peaceful under a canopy of stars that seemed brighter than Elena remembered from her childhood. "I got a call from the Department of Justice today," Jacob mentioned. As they paused beside the memorial garden Elena had planted in Thomas's honor. "They want to profile our work in their annual report on victim advocacy programs." Elena wasn't surprised by the government's interest in their foundation. Their success rate and innovative approaches to helping fraud victims had attracted attention from law enforcement agencies across the country. Did they say what specifically they wanted to highlight? The integrated support model, providing legal, financial, and emotional assistance all in one place. Apparently, most victim advocacy programs focus on just one aspect of recovery. Elena nodded, remembering her own experience of feeling overwhelmed by the different types of help she'd needed during their fight against Carmen. The Foundation's comprehensive approach had grown out of that personal understanding of how complex recovery could be for families facing powerful enemies. "We should do it," Elena decided. "The more attention we get, the more families we can help." They continued their evening walk, discussing plans for the Foundation's expansion and their family's future. Hope would start formal schooling in the fall, though she'd continue living at the ranch and receiving supplemental education from Mrs. Patterson, Elena, and Jacob were considering adopting Sophia if her family situation couldn't be stabilized. Giving Hope a sister and providing Sophia with the security she desperately needed. Sometimes I wonder what Thomas would think of our life together. Elena mused as they returned to the house. Jacob considered the question carefully. I think he'd be happy that you found love again, and proud that his death led to something that helps so many people. Elena agreed, feeling confident that Thomas would approve of the choices she'd made and the family she'd built with Jacob. Their love story had grown from tragedy, but it had created something beautiful and lasting that honored Thomas's memory. While building a better future for Hope. As they prepared for bed, Elena reflected on the day's events and the larger journey that had brought them to this moment of contentment and purpose. The foundation would continue growing, helping more families, exposing more corruption, and proving that justice was possible even for those who seemed powerless. Hope would grow up surrounded by examples of courage, integrity, and service to others. She would know that her biological father had been a hero who died protecting his family, and that her adoptive father had shown equal heroism by choosing to fight for strangers who needed help. Elena herself had been transformed from a victim into an advocate, from someone who'd lost everything into someone who could give hope to others facing similar darkness. The pregnant widow who'd collapsed at Jacob's gate had become a nationally recognized leader in the fight against corporate crime and family financial abuse. Their love story proved that the darkest circumstances could lead to beautiful outcomes. When people chose courage over fear, service selfishness, and justice over expedience. Elena and Jacob's marriage had been forged in crisis, but it had created a partnership that was changing the world one family at a time. As Elena drifted off to sleep beside the man who'd saved her life in every way that mattered, she felt profound gratitude for the storm that had brought her to his gate and the courage they'd found to fight for what was right. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families needing help, new opportunities to transform tragedy into triumph. But tonight, surrounded by love and purpose, Elena knew that she and Jacob had built exactly the life Thomas would have wanted for his wife and daughter. Their story of justice and redemption would continue inspiring others for generations to come, proving that love could indeed conquer all. When combined with the courage to fight for truth, the pregnant widow's collapse at Jacob's gate had been the beginning of a love story that changed not just their own lives, but hundreds of others who found hope through their example. Their legacy would live on through every family they helped, every injustice they exposed, and every act of courage they inspired in others facing impossible odds. In the end, Elena and Jacob had discovered that the greatest victory wasn't just surviving their own trials, but using their experience to ensure that other families would never have to face such darkness alone. Their foundation would continue growing, their love would keep deepening, and their example would keep inspiring others to believe that justice was always possible. When good people chose to stand together against evil, the storm that had brought Elena to Jacob's gate had ultimately brought light to countless families living in the darkness of despair. Their story proved that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the most desperate circumstances, and that true happiness comes not from avoiding suffering, but from transforming it into service for others who need hope. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us